Well, listen, the Old Bailey has heard, of course, some terrible cases in its history, but this has to be one of the most disturbing that anybody really has ever sat through. The absolute depravity of what Joseph McCann embarked on in April and May of this year. The spree of abductions, sexual assaults and rapes of 11 victims over the course of 2 weeks, starting in Watford, moving to London, then heading up to the northwest around Manchester and Cheshire, traumatising his victims, leaving them with a trauma that they will have to live with for the rest of their lives.
Born in London, England on February the 8th, 1985, Joseph McCann's crime spree started from a very young age when he was a small boy. His family moved on to a council estate in Manchester, and it was around this time that his interest in criminal activity started. Age just 11, he had his first run-in with the law, and by the age of 13 he'd already been convicted for theft. He and his two brothers created such fear amongst the community the following. Multiple complaints to the council. The family were eventually evicted in 1998. As he got old and more arrests followed, including carrying a knife, criminal damage, and the handling of stolen goods. He would set fire to cars and threaten children and the elderly. Despite moving, the brothers frequently returned to their old council estates and continued what was described by the newspapers and neighbors as a campaign of terror. It wasn't long before the brothers were all issued with antisocial behavior orders, commonly known in the UK as ASBOs. They were among the first people in the UK to ever receive this. The order banned them from entering the basic area and exhibiting physically or verbally abusive or antisocial behaviors in the city of Manchester. This didn't appear to have much of an impact on the boys, as they were photographed laughing and swearing at the crowd while coming out of court. In the basic area, crime fell by a third, and one supermarket claimed that their revenue had risen by £14,000. After the ASBO against the boys was given, their lawyer claimed it was against their human rights, and they appealed the ASBOs 3 times. This eventually resulted in them taking it to the Court of Appeal in 2001, but these appeals were flatly denied by the court. In 1999, the McCann family moved again, this time out of the Manchester area. They moved to the south of England, where the brothers continued their criminal activities. Around 2007, Joseph was living in Bedford. He recently become a father but was not present for the birth nor in the baby's life due to spending time in prison. He was released later that year, but on December 27th, he was arrested and jailed again for burglarizing an 85-year-old man's house and threatening to stab him. Fortunately, the elderly man had CCTV outside, and he was swiftly caught and sent back to prison. In September of 2008, he was sentenced to imprisonment for public protection, or an IPP, in order to serve a minimum of 2 years and 6 months inside. His IPP was a form of an indeterminate sentence, meaning that when his sentence was done, the parole board for England and Wales would have to determine whether or not he posed a risk and whether or not it was safe to allow him back out. He will be on a 10-year-long license, meaning that if any criminal activity happened in those 10 years, he will be recalled to prison immediately. While in prison, various professionals and offending managers expressed their deep concern that he still presented a huge risk to society. One statement said that he posed serious harm to the public and known adults, as well as a medium risk to children, prison staff, and prisoners. They believe that he could also be a massive threat to teenage girls, and showed signs of wanting to sexually exploit them. Due to the analysis of the professionals, his many appeals for release were denied, and he spent over 8 years in prison. While Joseph was doing time, his brother Sean was also serving a 2-year sentence at HMP Peterborough for assault. Sean took his own life. While in prison, Joseph completed several rehabilitation courses and was eventually released on license in March of 2017. After he was released, he went back to Buckinghamshire to live with family, and then quickly moved out and off the radar. This meant his offender manager was not able to contact him or keep track of where he was. Despite his long stints in prison, he wasn't deterred, and the crimes just didn't stop. A few months later, he was arrested again and spent another 2 years in prison. When sentencing him, the judge told him that it would run concurrently with his IPP sentence. However, his offender manager team did not recall him on that sentence. If they had done, he would have had to repair before a parole board again before being considered for release. Unfortunately, this meant he was able to be released just halfway through his sentence. Staff of the prison contacted the probation services about their concerns surrounding the fact his sentence was not running alongside his IPP. They felt he was still evidently a very imminent threat to the public. Despite this, in 2019 he was released without appearing in front of a parole board. He continued to move around the country, evading his offender manager team's attempts to contact him. On April 21, 2019, his crime spree would take a much more frightening and sinister turn. At 3:00 a.m., he abducted a 21-year-old woman at knife point. As she was walking back from a nightclub, he drove her back to an unknown house and raped her. Although he had told her his name was Joel McCann, he was identified the very next morning by Hertfordshire police. However, they couldn't locate him. Just 4 days later, he abducted another woman in North East London, and subjected her to a horrific sexual assault. Over the space of 14 hours, he was spotted casually making a stop to a drive-through with a frightened woman in the back seat. She was also still in his car when he held another woman at knife point and forced her into the vehicle. While drinking bottles of vodka, he drove to Watford with the women and attempted to book into a hotel. After he was unsuccessful, one of the women smashed the vodka bottle over his head, allowing them both to escape. Investigators drew up a list of suspects based on previous offending, but as McCann had never committed a sex offense before, he wasn't on the list. These cases weren't linked with April 21st attack until over a week later. Following this, a nationwide manhunt was on to find Joseph McCann, and a reward of £20,000 was put up for anyone who could help. On May 5, McCann was back in Manchester. He met a woman in a bar and convinced her to let him go back to her house. Once at her house, he tied her up and raped both her 17-year-old daughter and her 11-year-old son. The daughter managed to escape out the window and ran for help, but Joseph was gone by the time the police and neighbors arrived at 8 a.m. Around 1 p.m. that day, a suspect had been arrested and taken into custody. But it wasn't Joseph McCann. While officers were interviewing the wrong man, McCann had moved on and driven to 1:30 p.m. He adopted a 71-year-old woman outside of a Morrison supermarket. He attacked her and raped her. He stole her car, and while the woman was still in it with him, he attacked and kidnapped a 13-year-old girl. She too was sexually assaulted. The pair managed to escape at a service station later that afternoon, but Joseph carried on in the victim's car. That same evening at around 6:30 p.m., he was driving in Cheshire when he forced two 14-year-old girls into the car and threatened to kill them. He was seen driving to a petrol station and buying a packet of condoms. The two girls, although not shown, were in the back. He was on a dangerous and disturbing rampage, fueled further by cocaine and vodka. He had no intent of stopping, and there was no limit to how far he would take his appalling crimes. Joseph McCann was now the most wanted man in the country. It was in this moment, however, that the police finally caught up with him. They spotted him in his car with the two girls in the back and began chasing him.
Let me go. What's yours? 8-6, urgent. Hands off me, hands off. Oh, crash. Obelisk way! Where is it? Where's he gone?
McCann crashed the car into a Mercedes and started fleeing on foot. Fortunately, the two girls weren't injured, just extremely shaken. He somehow managed to escape on foot before stealing a bike and riding away. He then abandoned the bike and booked a taxi at around 8:15 p.m. It was at this point the roadblocks had been set up in the area, and the police were closing in on Joseph McCann. Cheshire Constabulary, however, did not issue a warning to say he was in the area until 8:45 p.m. A police officer stopped the taxi, unknowingly spoke to McCann, who was holding a pint glass, and said he was returning home after a visit to the pub. The officer had a description of McCann and knew he would have a large tattoo on his stomach if it was him. He asked McCann to lift up his shirt, to which McCann shouted obscenities at him and ran out of the taxi. After almost 9 hours of chasing Joseph McCann in cars on foot and using helicopters on May 6 at 2:00 a.m., he was found hiding up a tree down a rural country lane. After a long battle with negotiators, he was finally detained and arrested. He taunted the police by saying, "If you were caught me for the first two, the rest of this wouldn't have happened." He also claimed that the young girls in his car had just wanted a lift and he was simply helping them out. He entered a not guilty plea to all the charges related to the 11 women and children. On December 6 of that same year, he appeared via video link from Belmarsh Prison at the Old Bailey Courthouse in London. Mr. Justice Eddis was presiding. McCann refused to come to court and complained that he was sleep deprived and physically couldn't make it in. Not only did he show no respect for the justice system, he showed no remorse to any of his victims. He was tried and unanimously convicted of a shocking 37 offenses. The jury praised the victims for their bravery and courage in coming forward. Joseph McCann was given 33 life sentences in order to spend a minimum of 40 years in prison for his heinous and appalling crimes. The judge branded him a classic psychopath, and his violent and horrific rampage was described as unprecedented. Police believe that for those 15 days they were hunting for him, he was using a variety of disguises, cars and false names. He was also being hidden and protected by various associates, and 6 people were arrested in connection with concealing him. The frightening and depraved acts that Joseph McCann inflicted on so many people and communities enraged the public. People couldn't fathom how he had been released from prison with his IPP sentence being ignored. BBC News said that the National Probation Service had not followed the correct procedures, and following his 2017 arrest he should have been made to answer to the parole board before being released. This would likely have been denied by the board, meaning he would have remained in prison. The Ministry of Justice conducted an investigation and review into what had gone wrong within the broader criminal justice system in dealing with Joseph McCann. Although not normally done, these findings were released to the public. They concluded that the National Probation Service did not manage McCann effectively or in line with the policies and procedures which set out the expectations for managing offenders who pose a high risk of harm. A very concerning case. This was a dreadful, dreadful set of offenses, and in this case, I think there was clearly an individual error. McCann should have been referred to the pro board after he committed further offenses. They also found that the management of him as an individual was not consistent enough with a high turnover staff, and subsequent files and paperwork that needed to be handed over being rushed. Other newspaper suggested that budget cuts and staff shortages within the MPs had a part to playing things too. After an internal investigation, one member of staff was demoted. Harry Fletcher, the former Assistant General Secretary of the Probation Officers Union, would say a recent parliamentary answer shows that one person a week is let out wrongly. There has never been a consequence as devastating as this.